Welcome everybody back into Nerd Sesh. As always, I'm Carson Bradburn. Alongside me is Logan Camden, and today we are going to be ranking the top 10 center peaks in NBA history. If you missed it, we already did this exercise for the top 10 guard peaks and the top 10 forward peaks. Now we are on to the strongest position in NBA history. I am unbelievably excited for this one. But before we get into it, Logan, I want to start by having each of us lay out our respective criteria, just because I think that's always important to do. And I'm coming off a 5-hour podcast, that is right, that I did the other day with Mars Talk Sports and the Hoop Talk podcast guys. And just talking with a bunch of people with different perspectives, I think it really is illuminating what your criteria is. How are you viewing value and ranking all of these players? So with that being said, how would you lay out kind of your fundamental criteria for this list?
I mean, I'm judging how dominant everyone was at their peak. The most dominant guys are going to be towards the top of my list. I think we got to judge everybody based on their era. I know Mars is very passionate about like the Bill Russell peak case, and so I think that's very important. Probably the most important thing to bring up when we're talking about any of these historical conversations. Like, you have to judge guys within their era. You can't criticize, Bill Russell for not having aspects of his game that, are in the modern game that he doesn't have just because he played, 50 years ago. Like, it just doesn't make logical sense. So 60, yeah. I just think that's the most important thing to mention when we're talking about these conversations is we're judging them based on when they played, how much better they were than their peers at their apex. So, I think that's it for me, is just we're basing these guys relative to their era, and we're not going to discredit anybody because they played in a different time period. I think that's most important.
Yeah, so the first and probably most obvious thing is that we are talking about peaks here, which is when you are at your absolute apex as a player. It's not your prime, which might be a decade plus, during which you are at a superstar level for the entirety of it. It is the few seasons in which you are at your absolute best. I don't have like a set length for every player's peak, because I think that the length of every player's peak is different, but it tends to fall in like that 2 to 5 year range. It does have to be a multi-year peak. I do have that standard just because I think there are some single season outliers. I want to see it sustained for at least 2 years. And then you make a really important point with judging everybody relative to era. And I would say it goes beyond just like the era bias that some people hold against players from the 60s or the 70s or what have you, just inherently being like, oh, the game wasn't nearly as skilled back then. The players weren't as talented. First of all, I think that every single sport you are going to see evolution over time. Obviously, the talent pool is going to get wider. The athletic training is going to improve. Strategy is going to improve. All of these things, rule changes, create the modern NBA. And I just don't think you can expect anybody to be decades ahead of their time. As you said, that's not how it works. But even more so than that, you have to understand the differences in terms of how individual players could impact the game in different eras. And I say that specifically for the center list. I believe that for every list, but it's going to be most important for this one because of the monumental impact that a dominant rim protector could have on the game before the three-point line, when spacing was worse, when everybody was essentially trying to get downhill. The sort of singular defensive impact that Bill Russell is obviously the GOAT, but generally players in the 60s and 70s, the great defensive bigs could have on that side of the ball. It's just a lot more difficult to replicate in the modern NBA. So that's pretty much the groundwork that I would lay. And then last thing I would say is I am purely evaluating your impact. This is my evaluation of how effective you were as a basketball player. I do not care about accolades. To me, accolades are like at best a rough approximation of how great a player was, but they're things that other people vote on. I disagree with other people all the time. I think people get stuff wrong, so there's no reason for me to base my opinion off of other people's opinions, which is literally what accolades are. And I also think that it's never an apples to apples comparison. Like, certain MVPs are more impressive than others. Certain championships also, we're not just counting rings here. The context is so important for all of these things that I ultimately just am going to make my individual evaluation and determination of all these players' impacts at their peak. I feel like that pretty much covers it. So before we get in to our number 10 spot, Logan, why don't you shout out some of your toughest cuts, honorable mentions? Because Lord knows, I mean, there are just so many great centers in NBA history.
I'm debating my 10 spot right now still.
Whoa! I caught him off guard. Do you want me to shout out my honorable mentions first then?
I'm just, damn, man, there's like 3 guys I really want to have in this 10 spot. Yeah, you run it down, man. I'm going to see if I'm going to make a Peyton Manning or if we're just going to run the play.
Okay, I do actually want to add one additional piece to my criteria, which is that I am adamant about judging relative to era, as I laid out. The one exception that I make to that is the pre-Russell, Wilt, Oscar, Jerry West, Elgin era, just because I think the league was so much in its infancy. Like, obviously, there's the pre-shot clock years, and probably most importantly, the NBA was legitimately segregated for a few years, and then the process of desegregation was kind of slow, and to me, that should be self-explanatory. But if you look at the history of basketball, 80% of the great players in NBA history are black, and that talent pool literally wasn't allowed in the league for a time and then wasn't allowed in full force for years. I think that should be obvious, but that's the one distinction I make when we're talking about judging relative to era. And I say that because George Mikan, relative to era, is one of the GOATs, but it is the one era that I do devalue. So I guess he can get an honorable mention. He's not on my list. There's one guy who I think probably is going to be somewhere on your list. So I kind of want to save my spiel about him because I have a lot to say. I guess I would shout out Patrick Ewing and Dwight Howard probably as my 2 toughest cuts after him. Ultimately, both of them all-time great defensive anchors. What Patrick Ewing did, especially if you look at the 94-95 range defensively, anchored 2 of the greatest defenses we've ever seen, and his scoring peak occurred a little bit earlier than that, more in the early 90s. The problem is just with his major limitations as a passer, he was never, to me, capable enough as an offensive player to be on this list and meet this really, really high standard, and did have some playoff issues on the offensive end that were significant, some serious dropping in terms of efficiency and volume as well. And I would say it's a pretty similar issue with Dwight. Defensively, he's one of the more dominant players that we've seen. Neither of these guys are at the absolute top tier, but they're both top 20 defensive peaks in the history of the game. The difference is just with Dwight as your offensive hub. I mean, he had major limitations as a passer, major limitations, and he wanted to be kind of this post-up big, but just wasn't effective enough in that role to be the driving force of a really good offense. So it just comes down to offensive limitations for both of those guys that keep them off of my list.
Dwight was one of the toughest cuts for me, too. I think I don't really know how people think of him now, but I have to think Dwight's a little bit underrated. I just think that, not that his peak was super brief, it was a really great 3 to 4 years, but he was so dominant, man. I really wanted to get him in this. I'm debating between 2 guys for my 10 spot, man. I also want to give an honorable mention to some throwback bigs. Dave Cowens, Willis Reed, I think were guys that I considered as well. I'll let you in on my dilemma right now, man. I am debating so hard in my 10 spot for David Robinson or Joel Embiid.
Okay. Well, I have one of those guys on my list, and I don't have one of the other guys. I would take Robinson personally.
I think so too. The reason that I just think that Embiid's playoff shortcomings are a little bit more notable, but David Robinson kind of has a similar dilemma where you see his production drop off really largely, but I don't think Robinson was ever as nearly as bad of a, well, I don't think Embiid was a terrible playmaker, but I think David Robinson I prefer marginally there, and then I think he just completely clears Embiid as a defensive player, but that's the dilemma that I was having here before we got the pod started. I have Robinson written down.
Yeah.
But I'm stuck, man.
So I would take Robinson, and Embiid for me would be one of the first 2 guys off. He's one of 2 guys, actually, I was waiting to see if you had them on your list to give the spiel. I prefer Robinson because although I think they are both playoff droppers, I think that Robinson had the potential to be an all-time great ceiling raiser. He had a skill set that was so scalable in the sense that he could be a really effective play finisher for you, and just defensively having arguably a top 5 peak we've ever seen. I would agree that he was a better passer than Embiid, although he also had some issues there in the playoffs, but he was a better passer overall. That's where I would give him the edge in terms of scalability, whereas I feel like as great as Embiid is, you're building a team around him. You're relatively rigid schematically on both sides of the ball, just in terms of defensively, obviously his lack of versatility because of pretty significant mobility issues. And then offensively, you are going to primarily operate through him as this like really high volume isolation post-up hub who is a great scorer, but in the playoffs, the jump shot has consistently been inconsistent for him. The playmaking has been an issue with like serious negative assist to turnover ratio. He hasn't been able to get to the line at the same meteoric rate. And so all of those issues have kind of been recurring problems for Embiid. And also, I would say that Robinson is the better regular season resume, like pretty clearly. And even though Embiid has a monumentally great regular season resume, you just can't overstate that David Robinson might be legitimately at his peak one of the 10 greatest regular season players that we have ever seen. And I'll get into some of the insane impact numbers with him, but just unbelievable floor raiser who is churning out 55 win season after 55 win season, elite defenses, and he is the centerpiece of good regular season offenses without all-star talent alongside him. It's just an incredible resume. So I kind of think he checks every box overall over Embiid. Like obviously Embiid would be the better scorer, but I think the defensive gap is big, like massive in Robinson's favor because he's almost a flawless defensive player. And then I think Robinson was a better regular season floor raiser, a little bit less of a playoff dropper, though they both are, and Robinson would be the better ceiling raiser.
And that's what I was having a dilemma with, is there wasn't like any clear-cut kind of case because neither of these guys were the guy on, like a championship team by themselves. Obviously David Robinson gets a championship, gets a few of them, but that's with Tim Duncan as the lead guy. So that was the dilemma I was facing. That being said, I do have David Robinson here in my 10 spot. I'll get into that unless you do have any honorable mentions.
I'm still waiting to see one more guy from you. So
I have him on my list. I got a feeling I know who you're talking about. Is it Moses?
Yeah. Well, let's not get into it now, Logan, if he's not in your 10 spot. We'll save it for whenever this player, whoever he may be, comes up. I do just want to say real quick, because I think a lot of people will expect Embiid to be on here, and I do think regular season, he'd make a very legitimate case. I think that his regular season peak is higher than the player who I have in my 10 spot, but it does come down to that lack of portability and the really significant playoff issues for him. And his absolute peak to me would be the 22 to 24 range, right? I think that that's when his scoring volume and efficiency peak, and he improves as a passer, although it never translated to the playoffs like you would have hoped, but the playoff dropping is significant and consistent. The best he ever held up in a postseason was 24, but overall, if you look at these years, he's dropping to like under 24 points per game in 22 and 23. His efficiency is plummeting, 45% from the field, 25% from three with the negative assist to turnover. That's where I just think this incredibly high bar he doesn't quite meet for me. I can imagine some people being upset about the guy who I have in my 10 spot higher, but I'll kind of get into why I do prefer his skill set, even though he's not as valuable a regular season player as Embiid.
Interesting. I do have Robinson in my 10 spot. I specifically went with 94 to 96. I think there's some different ranges you could go with, but in that time span, he's giving you 28, 11, and nearly 4 assists a night with almost 5 stocks a game. You're talking about the regular season impact. I mean, it's not like David Robinson has a star-studded cast around him in this time period, and every single year, as near the top of the MVP award, is dragging these teams to playoff contention. But the reason that I debated not having Robinson on my list is similar to guys like Dwight or Embiid, where I look at the playoffs and I go, these guys never climbed the mountain. And I feel like literally everyone above them on my list at one point in their career or another did accomplish that. They were the best player on a championship team. And you look throughout the course of the history, the position that produces that more than any other is the center spot. Like, you can't teach size, man. They always say that. Like, the big guys dominate the game. And Robinson never did that on his own, but I feel like his job was really hard, and I feel like you have to look at the context of that when he does get to the playoffs. Sure, he has his limitations as an offensive number one, but like you said, man, that wasn't really his role. And when you do see him cast as a number two and where he can do other things and isn't solely responsible for carrying the offense, which I don't think was his ideal role in the playoffs, Robinson did flourish. And so I think he has unique shortcomings, kind of like the guy in my number 9 spot, I think has some unique shortcomings when we're talking about offensive number ones and lead guys. Mm-hmm. That's kind of why both of the guys in my 10 and 9 spot, they are uniquely limited in ways. And it's not like a Bill Russell. I want to be clear about something, right? Like Bill Russell has shortcomings, but that didn't matter as much in his time period and was so dominant defensively that it doesn't really matter to me. When I look at the guys in my 10 and 9 spot, they do have legitimate shortcomings in a more modern version of basketball where I am going to hold it against them. That's why Robinson can't be higher on my list. That's why number 9 can't be higher on my list. I'll get into that in a minute. But Robinson is a dominant regular season player. He's one of the greatest defensive players of all time. I was shocked going back and looking at his in his awards. He only has one DPOY, man. That to me is nuts, Carson. What do you just attribute that to the dominance of that position, like that era just being loaded with defensive monsters?
It is an absolutely loaded era, and just as crazy as Robinson only having the one is that Hakeem Olajuwon, who is the greatest defender in modern NBA history, the greatest defender since Bill Russell, he's only got 2 of them. So it's just such a ridiculously stacked field where, like, you've got Rodman in there in the early years, and then obviously Dikembe racks up 4 of them in his career. He's going up against Hakeem. It's incredibly stacked. Zoe in the late 90s. Do I think that Robinson is a greater defender than a one-time defensive player of the year? Absolutely. And I probably would have given him, off the top of my head, the award in 91 as well when he anchored the number 1 defense, averaging 5.5 stocks per game, and did that without a significant amount of defensive help on that roster, without another rim protector. Like, I just think he was so transformative as that kind of one-man defense in a way that, although I'm crazy high on Rodman, who won it that year, he didn't. Versatility was his superpower. David Robinson was one of those, like, tier 1 interior defenders in NBA history. And even as a rookie, dude, I mean, he took a totally mediocre defense from the year previous, made them a top 3 defense right off the bat. So yeah, it's crazy. Even crazier still, if we want to talk about Spurs bigs, Tim Duncan never won one. There's a lot of weird shit with DPOY, man. There's a lot of weird shit. But what's funny is, like, it tends to go to either somebody who's got, like, the massive defensive box score or who's anchoring the best defense in the league. David Robinson has so many years when he's checking both those boxes, and he still only ends up with 1 Defensive Player of the Year award. I have him 1 spot higher at number 9. I have the same peak years as you. I think you kind of have to go with this stretch, even though it's not his absolute defensive peak, in my opinion, because he's still playing like a top 10 defender ever, and the offensive improvement is significant, like giving you 27.5, 11 and 4 on plus 5% relative true shooting with that top 10 all-time defense is incredible. We do have to start with the defense when we talk about David Robinson's value, because it is so absurd. Like, he's just one of the greatest athletes we've ever seen play the game, and I think in a lot of ways that's the foundation of his greatness on both sides of the ball. But when you're talking about this combination of quickness, full court speed, fluidity at 7'1" and a chiseled 235, if I do say so myself, like, he's an absolute freak, especially at this time, considering the position. There was nobody else moving like him at that size in the NBA. And so defensively, you have this impressive agility paired with just ridiculous rim protection, and he had great hands. So he is just, like, generating year-over-year stock numbers when we're talking about hitting crazy high steal and block thresholds that are really unmatched besides Hakeem in NBA history. And every single year he's churning out an elite defense. First 7 years of his career, the Spurs were a top 10 defense every single year. They were a top 3 defense more often than not. That includes the 1996 season. They were a top 3 defense. Then he gets hurt for the entirety of the 1997 season, basically. They are dead last in defensive rating that year. I think that is very telling about just how massive his impact on that side of the ball was. I also think, though, as a regular season offensive player, David Robinson was awesome at this time and is the driving force, the centerpiece of top 5 offenses in 94 and 95, of another top 10 offense in 1996. Had a really nice skill foundation as a scorer. Loved his face-up game. Again, had unique quickness and fluidity for his size. Did love the mid-range and was relatively reliant on that as a scorer, and he was a good mid-range shooter. That was a failing of his in the playoffs. He and Embiid both went through this, where they were just very reliant on the jumper in the playoffs, and it didn't translate at the same level. But Robinson got to the line at a monstrous rate, especially in the regular season, so that helped with his scoring efficiency, and he was an above-average passer. So it's just like monster box score production offensively in the regular season. Really good efficiency with this, again, basically arguably top 5 defensive impact on the other side of the ball. And so if you look at his overall regular season impact, it is absolutely all-time great. From 1990 to 1997, the Spurs won 68% of their games with David Robinson. They won 26% of their games without him. That's like an unfathomable difference. I will say that obviously includes the disaster 1997 season when he was hurt almost the whole year. They were the worst team in the league. Sean Elliott is hurt for a good portion of that year, so they just embraced the tank for that season, got Tim Duncan. But even if you look at other instances of Robinson's absence, like they won 55 or more games in 5 of his first 7 seasons. It's an incredible floor-raising job. Again, truly one of the all-time greats. One of the 2 exceptions to that was 1992, when they still went 42-26 with Robinson. They were 5-9 without him. So that's a massive difference, and that's pretty much the only sample size we have of injured David Robinson before 1997, when, again, his team went from dominant to worst in the league in his absence. And literally every time Robinson was off the floor compared to when he's on it, you just see such a massive difference. Of course, the super famous accomplishment of his is he joins the Spurs as a rookie and leads to one of the biggest single-season turnarounds in NBA history. They go from 21 wins to 56 wins, and he totally transforms their defense. I do think it's important always to bring up context whenever you see any sort of crazy single-season change like that. Like, they brought in Terry Cummings that year. Rookie Sean Elliott, who would become his best teammate of the pre-Duncan era, wasn't at that point, but was still a good quality player. They bring in Mo Cheeks, who then they trade for Rod Strickland, so their roster improved. But even with like some of those other factors at play, obviously Duncan joining for the 98 season, like it's not a coincidence when one guy's absence and then his return coincide with 2 of the biggest single season win total changes ever. Like 2 of the top 5 biggest we've ever seen are about David Robinson getting back on the basketball court. And I just think overall, like 55 wins a year pre-Duncan, when his best teammate was Sean Elliott, who was good, but was just like a 2-time All-Star, right? There's nobody who's reaching all NBA value alongside him, flawed supporting casts, and he was doing all that. So regular season, there's no question David Robinson would be higher than my 9 spot. It's just he did drop in the playoffs. He relied too much on the jumper, the finesse, his decision-making as the focal point of a team that was trying to win titles. That really got tested, and offensively there was some regression there and some issues there. He just wasn't meant to be the number 1 on a really good playoff offense. And in these years, he drops to 24, 11, and 3 on even true shooting percentage with more turnovers than assists in the playoffs. And the Spurs were a slightly below average playoff offense over the totality of those 3 years. So that's the criticism. That's the knock on Robinson. That's why I don't have him higher than this. And when I look at, say, my number 8 or my number 7, like those guys were also transformative defenders who were better offensive players, who held up better offensively in the playoffs. And that's why I give them the nod. I think that Robinson was overtasked in a tough situation, but I also just think he had his flaws as an offensive number 1. That being said, the impact, the ridiculous defensive value, the offensive versatility I am getting from him, where he could carry this volume load in the regular season, but he could also be like a phenomenal play finisher, having the jump shooting value, having the overall positive passing value. Impact, man. I mean, that's the metric that I am judging these players by, and David Robinson is one of the impact GOATs. So I think there are people who will probably overstate his offensive issues and understate how impressive it is for him to be as good as he was offensively in those circumstances while being among maybe the handful of greatest defenders that we've ever seen.
But he's in your 9 spot.
He is in my 9 spot because it's center and the position is so stacked.
So who's in the 10 spot? I have no idea where you're going to go with this.
So this guy's not going to be on your list. And I know that because he was on your forward list. It's Anthony Davis. And you considered him a power forward. I think you can go either way. I consider AD a center. I think that's where he's at his best. He has played most of his minutes in his career at center. It's like about 2/3 of them, according to Basketball Reference. And even in his peak seasons, which is 2018 to 2020, in which he played with other centers, DeMarcus Cousins, some in New Orleans, and then played alongside the famous tandem of JaVale McGee and Dwight Howard in LA. Like, still most of his minutes in these years came at center. So that's where I view him as a 5. And over these 3 seasons, Anthony Davis gives you 27, 11, and 3 with 4 stocks per game, a steal and a half, 2.5 blocks on almost plus 5% relative true shooting. We're talking about some of the great defensive peaks ever, and that's just going to be a theme throughout this list. The impact that a great defensive big can have is so monumental, especially, again, when we go further back in history. But I still view AD as like a guy who had a top 20 defensive peak ever. He wasn't a one-man defense in the way that a Robinson was, or a Hakeem Olajuwon was, or a Bill Russell, or a few guys who we'll talk about today were, because he didn't have that like tier 1 all-time rim protection. He didn't have that tier 1 all-time post defense. Like, as an interior defender, he was great. He was a great rim protector. He was a really good post defender. I'm just holding him up to this extremely high bar and saying, like, you could put replacement level players around David Robinson, and at his best defensively, you were going to be a top 3 defense, maybe the best defense in basketball. AD never did that. There are a lot of years in New Orleans where they're pretty average defensively, but what I love about him so much is the versatility, the ability to be a really high-level rim protector, to be a really high-level defensive rebounder, and be able to play every defensive coverage, which in his era is at such a premium, where it is so valuable if bigs are able to switch, where it is very valuable to be able to come up and play at the level and affect pocket passes, where he's got such great hands and can generate steals, to be able to cover ground on the perimeter and bring that interior value. I think that's where, like, AD could be a great drop big for you. He could be a great switching big. I mean, he could even play at the 4 and the 5. All these things, I think, are just a testament to why he is such a great defensive big in this era. But again, he's still not reaching the defensive heights of some of the other guys who we're going to talk about today. And then offensively, this is a very high scoring peak for AD. And one thing that I really like about him, which also arguably is related to one of his drawbacks, is AD was a phenomenal play finisher when it comes to being a lob threat, pick and roll, off of cuts. That's where he thrived as a scorer. He was solid in terms of self-creation as a scorer, and he had pretty good scoring versatility. So the duality here is I like his ability to fit in and be efficient as a scorer because he falls into that play finishing mold. I also think you have to acknowledge there were guys who could just carry heavier loads as more of creators, as significantly better passers, for example. This is something that we talked about with our KG versus Anthony Davis conversation. Like, I think that KG is totally clear of AD, and a big reason for that is KG was a better isolation scorer, better post-up scorer, and a much better passer. So those are the limitations for AD offensively, and they are real. Like, he's not a high-level creator when we're talking about this list. He's a limited passer. He was not a great post-up or isolation player. His jumper could be inconsistent. And so he just, like, wasn't a very good floor raiser. In fact, he's the weakest floor raiser on this list. Like, everybody else was more capable of just elevating the group around them in the regular season to 50-plus wins. AD was never really one of those guys, even at his best. He also doesn't have crazy impact metrics, like +6 on-off differential over these 3 years. That's a good number, but it's not necessarily what you're expecting from a guy who I would have considered a top 5 player in the league at this time. And so those issues are significant enough that I couldn't consider AD any higher than this. Like David Robinson, you can talk about playoff flaws. If you put AD in those offensive situations, I think he would have actually fared worse in those playoff runs, and then he wasn't the level of defensive force David Robinson was. He wasn't nearly the level of regular season player, so that's where I have to consider AD's flaws. But, man, do I love him as just like my co-best player overall, which is exactly what he was for the 2020 Lakers, right? I think LeBron was slightly the best player, but it was arguable series to series throughout that playoff run especially. To anchor an elite defense with great versatility, to score 27, 28 points per game efficiently in a way that fits alongside other players, and especially, like, I don't want to overrate the 2020 playoffs just because we have to understand we're talking about multi-year peaks, and that is a 20-something game sample. But holy shit, man, what a run that was. And it was outlier jump shooting from mid-range. It was outlier jump shooting from beyond the arc, but the two times that we saw AD in the playoffs in this 3-year stretch, it was that when he played like a top 3 player on the planet. And then it was 2018 when he also had like a really, really impressive individual run for 2 series. And the overall numbers, 28.5 points on plus 8% relative true shooting. Again, there's outlier jump shooting in there that has to be considered with the small sample, but that fully realized version of Anthony Davis, I just love. And yeah, I get it. There are people who will say Embiid reached significantly higher heights in the regular season, and I would flat out agree with that. I would also say AD reached significantly higher heights in the postseason, significantly so, and he played a style that was so much more scalable, so much better in terms of ceiling raising, and ultimately I just think there's an easier path to AD being, again, your co-best player, or maybe like a really, really elite second guy on a title team than there is for Embiid with his playoff flaws and really rigid style.
Complementary is the word that I would use for Robinson and AD both, and I think they both have that same part of their game that, you know, they were number 2s when they won championships, but I think that is an important distinction to make. I don't know if I would argue if somebody made the Embiid case against AD. I couldn't. Like, as a regular season floor raiser, I don't really think it's that close. Like, no. I think Embiid just totally clears, but I think you make the important distinction, like, all the little things that maybe you take for granted. AD's versatility and ability to defend 1 through 5 any day. His defensive playmaking, his ability to protect the rim at such a high level. And I know Embiid could protect the rim at a high level, but it's, in my opinion, still just completely different.
Totally. And the ability not just to guard in space, but to get up and down the floor defensively is such a difference maker between the two of them. Like,
well, you're not getting killed in transition.
Some of the regular season metrics will paint Embiid as like a defensive player of the year caliber defender, and I do think Embiid was a very good defender. I would never have him in those conversations just because I think his flaws repeatedly were more of an issue in the playoffs when people are hunting your flaws and you're going up against the best offenses than they were in the regular season. The pure rim protection is great. I'd still take AD's pure rim protection marginally, and he's way better at everything else defensively.
The center position is so loaded, though, man. Like, I'm even surprised that AD made the list. Like, I don't know if AD would make my centers list.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's going to come down to a conversation that maybe we are about to have.
We're on the verge of it, man.
That's what I really, really considered. I mean, for me, it was going to be AD in my 10 spot or my 11 spot. I'd already decided that I value his peak over Embiid's for the reasons that we laid out. And so it came down to Anthony Davis versus Moses Malone, and I left Moses off my list, Logan. But why is he on your list first?
That boy couldn't read, but he could damn sure get a rebound. Petersburg legend Moses Malone. I couldn't leave the Virginia legend off, man. Moses Malone grew up like 30 minutes away from where I grew up, man. That's why we both can't read. They just don't teach it in this region of Virginia, unfortunately. Mm-hmm. I chose Moses Malone's peak from 81 to 83, 2 of those seasons in Houston before he comes over to Philadelphia. Moses Malone, I think, has one of the most complicated legacies in basketball history. And what I mean by that is I think the range of opinions that you can get on Moses Malone, the basketball player, can vary very widely depending on who you talk to. I think some would consider him maybe a top 5 center of all time with his accolades. It's rare that a guy wins 3 MVPs, right? That is, you are just already in rare air when you're talking about that. I think some people would say, he's so I was going to say poor, like unique, I will say, as an offensive player, that maybe they wouldn't even, maybe they would underrate him and say he doesn't even belong in the top 10. I do put him at number 9. I think that a misconception about Moses, another one, I think some people can drastically overrate Moses as a defensive player as well. I don't think Moses was a super impactful defensive player. I think some of the raw numbers in terms of like stocks and stuff like that can overrate him as a player when we look at them. Right in this peak, he's giving you almost 3 stocks a game, and in one season, very close to it, exactly a steal a game basically, and then 1.5 blocks per game is his average over this time period. And I think some people can look at that and go, he is a super impactful defensive player or something. But no, you look at the defenses that he was responsible for mostly in Houston in that time period, and they're bottom 10 almost basically every single year.
I think literally every single year, and a number of them are dead last.
On the inverse of that, I think Moses can sometimes get underrated as an offensive player. Now, that being said, I'm going to rain some praise on Moses. I want to get all the negative stuff out of the way. I think Moses is so uniquely bad as a playmaker, it baffles me. Like, the numbers are actually ridiculous, man.
Yeah.
He is giving you, over this 3-year peak, 1.6 assists per game to 3.6 turnovers per game. Like, I think Moses is so uniquely limited as a playmaker. And you know what, man? I'm not even going to, if people hold that against him and that's the reason why you don't have him on the list, you know what? I don't even blame you. That being said, I think that he can get underrated as an offensive engine, though, because every season in Houston is top 10 in offensive rating. In 1979, they're number 1 in offensive rating. In 4 seasons in Philadelphia, they are top 10 offenses in Houston. Houston has a 51% win percentage with Moses and a 23% win percentage without him. In Philadelphia,
I do think, can I just add some context for that?
Go ahead and shit on him.
Whole
Yes, please.
sample is from a season in which they also sucked when Moses was on the court. I'm not shitting on him. I'm providing objective truth. I think that's important when you mention that all of that data basically is coming from the 1978 season when Moses was on the court, they were 23-36. So they were bad with him and they were bad without him that year. But go ahead.
I don't want to act like he was a crazy transfer. It's not like Jokic's on-off numbers, right? But they are basically going from an average middle-of-the-road team. And I don't think Moses had great supporting cast in Houston. I think those were bad teams, like that he was dragging to be mediocre. And there's still a 27% win percentage gap between with Moses and without. And then in Philadelphia, they go from a 72% win percentage to basically 50% without Moses. And I'm just giving, obviously, my peak is still just 81 to 83 here with Moses, but I think these numbers paint a good picture of the player that Moses was. But the reason I say he's so polarizing and so unique is just because of where his value is coming from. I think Moses is the greatest rebounder of all time. I get Wilt and Bill have way gaudier numbers and they're more ridiculous. I think Moses is the greatest rebounder ever. He led the NBA in offensive rebounds per game 7 straight seasons, giving you 6.3 offensive boards per game. He led the NBA outright in rebounding per game 6 times. He led the NBA in free throw attempts per game 5 times. Like, it's goofy. It is probably the strangest way any superstar has generated offense. But you said the word. Impact. Effectiveness. Like, you can't argue that Moses wasn't effective. And in this time period, he's giving you 28 points per game, 15 rebounds a night, 2 assists per game to basically 4 turnovers per game.
And that's a rounded up, too, let me tell you.
And that's a rounded up turnovers per game, too. But yes, it is. And he's giving you a steal and 2 blocks per game. So I think Moses is a very unique and complicated
Moses never
offensive
averaged
player.
2 assists per game in a season in his
That's
career.
ridiculous. That blew my fucking mind, man. Like, do you know how bad you have to be as a playmaker to not get 2 assists per game, bro? Yeah.
Incredible.
Moses, I think, is one of the most unique and complicated players in NBA history. Nonetheless, I think he was effective, and I think he was impactful in a way that not many other players are. I think he's the greatest rebounder of all time, and I think just unstoppable on the boards. And the raw volume that he's producing is so effective. It's just crazy to me that a guy that has this sort of game could be this effective in any era of basketball, and yet he was. So I'm biased, obviously. I couldn't leave the Virginia legend here off, but Yeah, Moses in my 9 spot, man. Him and Chuck, man, might be the two most unique superstars in NBA history. I'm trying to think of other guys that are just
Clyde Drexler, very, very unique.
He's one of those guys, though. I would put Moses in that tier of just most unique phenoms in NBA history.
Yeah, he is a weird player. So I would also agree that 81 to 83 are the peak seasons, and I think that you did a nice job of laying out what did make Moses so effective, because it is this incredibly strange offensive arsenal, but he's such a monstrous offensive rebounder that it's legitimately funny. I think you will laugh going back and watching Moses play more so than any other great player because of the number of possessions.
He's getting them me-bounds. Angel
so
Reese.
Many. Which I think, first of all, yes, it boosts his offensive rebounds a little bit that he did rebound a lot of his own misses, but also those are called Z boards these days, and we praise Jokic for rebounding his own misses, and we say, actually, he's even a little bit more efficient as a scorer because that's really just one scoring attempt, even though it shows up as 2 on the stat sheet. So I think we got to give Moses some props for that too, just the high percentage of time that he did collect his own misses, where maybe true shooting percentage even slightly understates his scoring efficiency because of that. And then there's also just the really awesome off-ball value of being a great offensive rebounder and just generating more chances for your team. I do think Moses is the greatest offensive rebounder we've ever seen. And he was a guy who you could build really good offenses around. Like you said, Houston, pretty much an automatic top 10 offense in his time there. Philly, very good offenses as well. I do think there's important context to add about the situations that I'll get to. But outside of the great offensive rebounding, which really is great, he was a pretty weird focal point of an offense because he was this solid isolation player, had a decent intermediate jump shooting game, had his strength and physical force there, but he wasn't great in that aspect of the game, and he is truly the worst passing superstar ever. To post worse than a 1-to-2 assist-to-turnover ratio in your peak seasons is absolutely insane. Dwight is another guy who was really bad as a passer. Patrick Ewing, very limited as a passer. But I think Moses probably takes the cake among them all. So that's where you just have this super funky, flawed offensive player. It really does matter to me that you're capable of creating for others at even a basic level. When you're drawing double teams, you can spot cutters, you can make the basic reads. Moses didn't do that. He is an all-time black hole offensively. And defensively, he was good, not great. He was a great defensive rebounder, but he was just pretty good as a rim protector. You're even talking about the stock numbers. For a big of that era, they're really not very impressive. And then, the rim protection is pretty good, but not good mobility, not a very good defensive motor or defensive IQ. He didn't have elite size for the position. So if we're talking about these centers who are going to come up on this list, Moses very clearly had the second lowest defensive peak of anybody we're going to talk about, and the other guy is a pretty massive exception in terms of what he's doing on the offensive side of the ball, so he makes up for it in a very unique way. But throughout Houston, Moses was exclusively on bad defenses every single year. And then he joins Philly in 1983, and he's part of a really, really good defense and a great team. But I think people can underrate how great that Sixers team was, because it's an extreme rarity in NBA history that a team this talented gets to add a player as good as Moses for such a low cost. Honestly, I would say the only example that exceeds it is the Warriors adding KD, which is obviously number one. But this was a team that was averaging 60 wins per year over the previous 3 seasons, that had been to the finals twice in the last 3 years. And they just had to give up Caldwell Jones to get Moses. So he just slots right into that center spot. It's literally okay, well, we'll let Harrison Barnes walk to bring in Kevin Durant. So he had this great defensive infrastructure around him. They were already a top 5 offense before Moses got there. It's one of the great top 5s ever to have Dr. J, Bobby Jones, one of the great defenders ever, Andrew Toney, such an effective scorer and playoff riser, Mo Cheeks, one of the better point guards of the 80s. So I think all that context is really important, that he went through a lot of years in Houston where he wasn't a great floor raiser, where the teams were pretty mediocre, very, very flawed defensively. And then he gets dropped onto a 60-win team and he takes them up a notch. He's Moses Malone. Like, obviously he belongs in these conversations, but did he ever do anything as a floor raiser remotely comparable to like a David Robinson? Absolutely not. And am I convinced by the idea that, oh, well, he did it as a number one. He climbed the mountain and that's why he's better? No, I'm not, because if you drop David Robinson on the 1983 76ers, you better believe they're winning the title. Like, it's such a fortunate situation.
The one thing I wanted to add that I think I don't disagree with your thought exercise. I think Moses was more valuable in the era that he played in because rebounding was just so important at that time of the game. And that's why I have Moses over David. Like, don't get me wrong. I don't think I think your thought exercise is right. Like, I agree with your logic. I think Moses is more valuable in the time he played in. His skill set is wonky and it's weird, but I think rebounding was more important then, and he was so dominant and unstoppable at that's why I have him here, because it was so important in that era of the game.
Well, I feel like I'm accounting for that in my evaluation of Moses, that like certainly a player with this very unique, funky offensive skill set, if you put him in a different era, it wouldn't translate. He was extremely effective in his era. I still don't think as effective as a David Robinson, who single-handedly transformed his team's defense, who was so much better as a passer, who was a significantly more versatile offensive player, and again, just was dragging not great supporting cast to 55 wins every year. Another thing that I think people will kind of hype up with Moses is Houston, right? He drags this team to the finals in 81, and then they win 46 games in 82, and then he leaves, and they win 14 games in 83, and they're one of the worst teams really in NBA history, and so isn't that a testament to his value? I do think it's really important to note the context that Robert Reed also left that offseason. He was the second best player on that Houston team in 82. Really good player. In total, 3 of the 5 primary starters from that 82 team left. Elvin Hayes got another year older. He regressed. So obviously Moses was valuable, but was he the difference between that 32-win gap, that change over one season? No, I think there's a lot of important context around there, and there's a lot of movement there. And then another thing I think people will bring up a lot with Moses is the 3 MVP factor. And I said this off rip, I just don't care about accolades. And I do view these pretty much all as weak MVPs. I mean, maybe not 83, just considering the precedent and the value on being on such an elite team, and Philly was clearly the best team in basketball that year, and he was the best player, and that one's solid. But I do think he capitalizes on this like weird little era where it's post-peak Kareem, and there's voter fatigue with Kareem, and they don't want to be giving him MVP every year, and before Larry and Magic peak. And even then, like, I think his 1979 MVP is really, really weird. And this is where, Logan, I would give more credit to his supporting cast, I think, than you laid out, because I think offensively, Moses was in some really good situations in Houston. And this season, like, they had sucked the year before, right? That's the year where Moses was hurt some. They sucked when he was hurt. They also sucked when Moses was on the court. They add Rick Barry, who obviously is not his peak self, but still bringing, like, elite passing, really good offensive value. Barry is a big driver of, like, a significant offensive leap. But the defense is still terrible. They're still just like a 47-win team, even though offensively the supporting cast is really good. Rick Barry, Rudy T, Calvin Murphy, Young, Robert Reed, Mike Dunleavy, Mike Newland, who was past his prime. Like, there's just a lot of really good offensive talent here. And Moses was an okay defender, scoring under 25 points per game with negative passing value on a team that, like, didn't overachieve. I don't know. It's just really hard for me to see how that's an MVP season. And I also don't want to underrate the offensive infrastructure that was in place. Like, the 2 seasons before Moses joined the team, 1975 and 76, Houston had back-to-back number 1 offenses on the back of Rudy T and Calvin Murphy. And so those guys obviously regressed a bit through Moses' time there, but he did come in to an offense that was already elite. So I think that we've basically addressed it at this point versus Robinson. I think there's a big difference in terms of regular season value. I do prefer Robinson overall. And again, the number one point just doesn't really do it for me as much when you're talking about a guy who was the number one in such a fortunate situation in Moses. And a guy in David Robinson who, once you did put like a really good team around him, 1999, you could at least make a cheeky argument he was the best player on that team. I do think he was still the best defender on that team, and Duncan wasn't what he would become offensively. I would take Duncan, but the impact was still elite from Robinson at that point in his career. And then with AD, I just prefer like the elite defensive value, the offensive variety, him being such a seamless fit in more situations. It's not that I'm knocking Moses. It's not that I'm calling him Andre Drummond with some sort of boost. Like, I don't think that's true. I just think there are certain aspects of his resume that get overrated to me.
I just think he was so dominant as a rebounder. And I don't know, I already said this stat, but like Houston won 23% of their games without
Logan,
Moses when he was there.
I know, but like that's not a good stat because that all comes from the year when they were 23-36 when Moses played. So they were bad with him, bad without him.
In that same sample, they're 27% better with Malone, man. Like, I just don't see
Logan,
how that
you keep on repeating the same stat that I'm telling you is not a good stat, and I'm very clearly saying why. That would be like if I said in 2020, the Warriors were terrible without Steph Curry, and when Steph Curry played, they won 70-something% of his games, even though if Steph had played that year, the Warriors would have been, 500, like they were barely above that in 2021 when he did actual superhero shit. That's what I'm saying. It's important to understand the context of, okay, well, how good actually was the team at that specific time when the guy was actually on the floor, too?
Okay, I'm done going in circles. I'm not going to change your mind. I think Moses is the greatest rebounder of all time. I think you saw his value as a floor raiser in Houston when he was helping churn out elite offenses. I think rebounding was more important in this era of basketball, and that's why Moses was so dominant with his physical profile. He was dominant and so physically imposing. Like, there just weren't guys that could match up physically with him. And then you do see his value as a ceiling raiser when he does get to Philadelphia. I agree with you. I think that's one of the greatest basketball teams ever assembled. But it's one of the greatest basketball teams ever assembled, not because of the totality of talent, but also because Moses Malone was fucking dominant. And you got to have him here.
But more so because of the totality of talent, the fact that they were churning out 60-win seasons and finals appearances before he got there.
I mean, that's
agree.
a great team, but Moses is great.
Moses is great, but to present Moses as the reason that team was great is insane.
I think Moses is the reason that team won the championship and mowed down everybody. I think Moses was the best player on that team.
I think Kevin Durant is the reason that the Warriors won the title in 2017 because he put them over the top and made them undeniable.
Okay.
Right? Like, you can acknowledge that a player can be great and also be in a great situation. And maybe they are the difference between them
it's like
going to the finals and losing and winning the title. But a David Robinson might be the difference between a team winning 24 games and 55 games.
It's like AD was, on a really good team in 2020.
Yeah, he was. And I just prefer his skill set. I think he was a transformative defensive player. And offensively, I would say that Moses, relative to era, like within the context of his time, is a better offensive player than AD. I think it was easier to build a top 10 offense around Moses, but I still think the defensive gap is bigger between the two and the versatility gap.
I think Moses was more impactful than both Robinson and AD.
Okay. I really struggle with Robinson just because I think the regular season gap is so massive. And for both of them, again, like it feels to me like the only point for Moses, and we'll move on in a second because we have said a lot about Moses Malone, is the notion he got over the hump. And what I would say is, okay, well, Robinson didn't have the teams in his prime that realistically could have won the title around him. And then AD played at a top 3 level on the planet in 2020. So it's like if he's your co-best player, it just feels like we're drawing a very, very fine line there and maybe rewarding Moses for his situation and punishing certainly Robinson, or maybe understating how great Anthony Davis was for a team that won the title just in the name of opting instead to talk about, who was the guy on a team, which I think can be an oversimplification. But anyways, let's move on to number 8. Who do you have there, Logan?
I mean, there's definitely a gap to me between 9 and everybody else. I think we have entered a different tier. Number 8's peak is brief, but it's super high. I've got Bill Walton in my 8th spot. I think he has to be on a list like this. To me, Bill Walton is the guy that you think about, in my opinion, when you were making this list. Also, I should have mentioned this at the top, and if you've listened to our other episodes, I've said this before. All of my peaks, I try to make 3 years, so I just think it's clean. I think it's really comparable across everybody. I know you said that you have peaks that have different, ranges depending on each guy. So, for Walton, maybe your peak is, just 2 years, right, where he was at his apex. But for me, I do have 3, so that's why my numbers will be a little bit different, a little bit more skewed. So it's from 75 to 78. Walton is giving you 18 points, 14 boards, and 4 assists a night with 2.5 blocks and 1 steal a game on 51% from the field. And Walton is giving you complete value everywhere on the court. And that is the distinction that I would make between a Moses and a David Robinson and even an Anthony Davis, who I talked about in last episode. It's like there's just no holes in Bill's game. Bill is giving you elite defensive value, where he was elite as a defender at UCLA and then was elite as a defender when he entered in the NBA. He was a phenomenal passing big man, truly ahead of his time and unique as an offensive playmaker and engine at the center spot in a way not many players were in this era. Again, just completely ahead of his time. In a great rim protector, again, in a defensive anchor in the way of Moses wasn't, while still giving you elite rebounding value. Not Moses rebounding value, because that's completely outlier stuff, but a great rebounder as well, and then a pretty good scorer with good touch and on the block. But the thing about Bill is that it's so seamless, and it just fits within the flow of the offense. And that's why I like and appreciate Bill's game so much. It's not gaudy scoring numbers like Moses, where he's giving you 30 points per game a night, but it's efficient and it's within the flow of the offense where, like you mentioned with a Moses, you're dumping the ball into the block every possession and he's going up with it and then either rebounding his own miss and going back up with it. Bill is efficient with his touches in getting it within the flow of the offense, where he's not dominating the ball and mucking up the flow of your offense. It's really seamless and easy. And honestly, I mean, who fucking knows how high Bill could have been if he had had the opportunity to get better? Like, that to me is the most interesting part of Bill's case. It's not, is he on this list? It's how much higher could Bill Walton, rest in peace, could he have climbed on this list? Like, we were just robbed of one of the greatest basketball careers of all time. And that, to me, is the case. And another thing that makes Bill so unique is the fact that he went out at the peak of his powers. In 1978, he wins NBA MVP on a 58-win Portland team. In 77, they had won the title when he was finals MVP. So, who knows? I mean, Bill Walton, to me, we always talk about the greatest what-ifs of all time, what Derrick Rose could have been, Len Bias, some of these tragic basketball stories. Bill Walton's not tragic because we did get to see it and it was fully realized, but man,
yeah,
we have another decade of what could have been. And what's crazy, too, is even later in his career, Bill Walton goes on and is a productive member of some great Boston Celtics teams. Obviously, doesn't have the athleticism, doesn't have the mobility because that's been completely robbed of him, but he was still a productive player coming off the bench for some of those Boston teams with his intellect and his basketball IQ. You just wonder, man, what could have been, how high could have Bill climbed on this list? All that being said, Bill is unique in the sense on this list that he is giving you complete two-way value on both sides of the ball at such a high level. It's just so brief. So Bill is in my number 8 spot. I think he's got to be on this list. And to me, he's kind of the poster boy of this list.
Right. I mean, this is why we talk about peaks instead of overall career rankings, or that's why we're doing it right now, to acknowledge the guys who don't have the longevity, but when they were at their best, were some of the best to ever do it. And Bill is literally like the standard for that, man. I am so fucking high on Bill Walton. I think this is clearly the second best peak of the 1970s, only to Kareem. I take this version of Walton over Dr. J, who I think is really the only other contender for that second spot. And I think it rivals the next name on my list, who a lot of people would probably have as a top 5 player of all time, basically a lock for a top 10 player of all time, which, yeah, I agree with because there's such a massive gap in longevity. But if you're just talking at their apex, I'll say it. I think that there's an argument for a Bill Walton over a Tim Duncan. So I couldn't say that this is quite a tier break between him and David Robinson, because Robinson's regular season value was that insane, but it is clear to me. And Walton is, again, like pushing being even further up on this list. And overall, across all positions, it might be a top 15 peak ever, because peaking 8 on the center list is so much more impressive than 8 on the guard list or 8 on the forward list, because so many of the greatest players in NBA history are centers. But I do have this as a 2-year peak, 77 and 78, because I think that's when he became the MVP, the second best player of the 1970s. And the box score isn't going to fully capture his impact. I mean, it's 19, 14, 4.5 with a steal and 3 blocks a game on plus 4.5% relative true shooting. But it's the impact with Walton. It's the fact that this guy was the offensive engine and the defensive anchor for a team that was top 5 in both offensive and defensive rating both of these years, number 1 in net rating both of these years, won the title, then started the 1978 season 50-10 before Bill Walton got hurt. They fell apart, go 8-14 down the stretch without him. And overall, over these 2 seasons, the Blazers went 92-31 with Bill Walton. They're averaging a 60-win pace. They went 15-26 without him. So you're talking about going from the best team in the league with him to one of the worst teams in the league without him. And there's a legitimate sample size of that. There's just very few players in NBA history who had that kind of value. And he's generating this level of elite team success, dominance on both sides of the ball, with like one low-end all-star teammate in terms of big names on his supporting cast. Like, shout out Mo Lucas. I love the guy. Obviously, Luke Walton is named in honor of Mo Lucas. That's not obvious, but that is true. I don't know why I said obviously, but that's a fun fact. And like, I don't want to devalue the fact that that Portland team was fun in terms of their ability to play with pace offensively, and they had a really good coach in Jack Ramsey, and they had some nice offensive pieces around him. But he was the centerpiece of the offense. He was the engine, if you will, as a big, which is a rare thing. And defensively, he's the reason that they were what they were, like basically singularly. He was one of those one-man defenses. Also, regular season is incredible, but 1977, I mean, one of the great playoff runs, one of the great finals performances ever that, of course, is wildly underrated because everything is underrated with Bill Walton. But he averaged 18, 15, 5.5, and over 3 blocks a game in the 1977 playoffs. The only dudes ever to hit the thresholds of 15 boards, 5 assists a game, and 3 blocks a game in a playoff run are 77 Walton and 03 Duncan, which I consider arguably the most impressive individual playoff run in NBA history. So when we are talking about Walton's value, I think we have to start with, again, understanding how basketball was played in this era. That we're not talking about 1960s levels of offense where nobody will ever touch Russell's defensive impact. He's also just the defensive GOAT. I mean, he was so far past his peers defensively, even in this era when a great center could have more defensive impact than they've ever been able to since. But we're still talking about the 70s, pre-3-point line. So that rim protection was supremely valuable. And that was at a premium. Like, defensive mobility mattered, but obviously bigs weren't being asked to cover the ground that they are nearly in today's game. Like, it's not even remotely comparable. The most valuable thing you could do was be an elite rim protector. He was that. He was massive, elite size, phenomenal defensive IQ, great positioning, massive deterrence, really great verticality as a rim protector, which I think is so valuable. Like, to be the level of defensive force that he was, and to put up the block numbers he did, and only average 2.5 fouls per game in the regular season at this time when bigs were racking up fouls league-wide. Like, I think that's so impressive. And his mobility was solid. And he's an elite defensive rebounder. So you're getting a guy, another one who's at a top 20 defensive peak ever. I know I've said that a few times, but that's the reality. Like, most of the most impactful defenders ever were bigs. And then offensively, I just love building around Bill Walton so much because he's the best passing big pre-Jokic. I actually don't think it's close. Just such a great passing hub when it comes to spotting cutters on a dime with speed, with accuracy, from creative angles, from the nail, from the elbows. Like, he was so great at setting up those high-efficiency layups for his teammates. And then in every way as a passer, handoffs as a hub, outlet passes to get the fast break started. Like, he was so damn good at all of that. And as a scorer, maybe underrated, just because I often think that great passers can be underrated as scorers because they leverage their scoring threat into passing more often. He had his flaws, but really good touch out of the post, nice face-up game, nice back-to-the-basket game, solid mid-range game. He wasn't an elite scorer, but I prefer his playoff offense to David Robinson just because I think he was such an amazing passing hub. And if both of them had their flaws as playoff scorers, I prefer the guy who I still think is incentivizing such a great style of team offense and who is providing such elite value in another way. So that's where I just think he holds up better. I think if you look at the skill set in the time, I think if you look at the impact, you look at the fucking results, man. This guy was on top of the world for 2 years, as was his team. If you don't think Bill Walton's in the top 10, I think you're out of your mind. And if you wanted to argue him a spot higher, I'd hear you out. I'd be interested.
So where does he rank on your list officially?
Yeah, I have him number 8, same spot as you.
Okay.
So we can move on. I mean, I love a Bill Walton Glaze Fest. Unless, is that a follow-up I see brewing, Logan? I'll answer any follow-ups about Bill Walton. I'm obsessed with him. I had a dream about him the other week, and I think I cried in it. Dead serious.
I'm just trying to piece together your list. I don't know. The gentleman that you described in number 7 is not who I anticipated you having there.
Well, you can't read me. You can't read me because I am unknowable. I already said it. I have Tim Duncan in 7, but let's go back to you, Logan. Who's in your 7 spot? Oh.
He's a little low on the Mr. Tim Duncan. He's a little low.
I don't think I am.
I don't think I am.
Well, we can talk about the difference between where I would have Duncan in an all-time player ranking and where I'd have him exclusively in a peak ranking. We can get there. Sure, we can get there.
I've got Mr. Jokic in my 7 spot.
Okay.
Jokic is complicated, man. I do think he's the greatest offensive player I've ever had the privilege of watching. I also think he is uniquely limited defensively in a way that, I mean, it's basically, I mean, in comparison, it's just him and Moses on this list, right? Like,
yeah,
I just couldn't have a guy that is this limited defensively as Jokic any higher. I think that being as dominant as he is offensively is probably the most valuable thing that you can do in the modern NBA, right? Like, I don't know, my philosophy has changed slowly but surely in this regard. Like, I do value the ability to create easy offense more than probably anything else in the NBA nowadays, right? That's why I have SGA and Jokic as my 1 and 2. I just think they do it better than anybody else in the NBA today. But I do value two-way ability, and Jokic is limited in that way and that nobody else is on this list. So, you know, I couldn't have him. And it's hard, right, because I have a guy like Bill Russell above him, right? And Bill Russell is uniquely limited offensively, but he's so dominant defensively, and that was the most important thing when Bill Russell played. And so it's like, I honestly think that Russell and Jokic have comparable cases, not in the sense of winning, but in the sense that they are limited on one side of the basketball, but their eras are so different. But I couldn't have Jokic any higher because of his defensive limitations. I mean, he's one of the most brilliant passers of all time. He is unstoppable as a scorer inside the arc, where he has immaculate touch, some of the greatest I've ever seen. We've said these things a million times if you've been listening to Nerd Sesh, but like, he is a freak offensively. Like this year, right, he had a down year shooting from behind the arc last year. This year, if you take out Heaves, he's up near over 45% from behind the arc. He is freakish touch as a big man. He's one of the greatest shooting big men of all time, while being one of the greatest playmaking big men of all time, while being an elite rebounder as well. But he is limited defensively. So I don't know if you want to spill the beans on where you have Jokic on your list. I don't know if you want to hide that close to your chest. Like, I you know what? Instead of that, like, how do you strike that balance, Carson? How do you, more so than anything else, like, what is your philosophy on a limitation like that, finding that balance between his unique defensive limitations while being one of the greatest offensive players ever?
This is why I laid out my criteria fundamentally as impact. And I try not to put into place any hard and fast rules about, whatever limitation on one side of the ball, just because I think there are always exceptions to any rule that you can lay out like that. The biggest one we still haven't talked about. It's Bill Russell. We'll get there when we get there. The second biggest one to me is Nikola Jokic. And the reason for that is he is so monumentally great offensively. In my opinion, the best offensive player to ever exist, that his overall impact still slightly surpasses that of a Tim Duncan at his peak, still slightly surpasses that of a Bill Walton at his peak, because this is a guy who single-handedly is going to take your offense from being potentially one of the worst in basketball to being one of the best in basketball. Like, what he has done in terms of some of these impact metrics on off, we've never seen anything like in the era in which we have that data starting in 1997. He's literally the on-off GOAT, plus 12.6 on-off differential in his career. That's the best ever. I think I misspoke the other day when I was on with Mars and I said that KG has the best. He has the second best. Jokic has the best. And a huge portion of that value is coming, obviously, on the offensive end. Now, defensively, do I think that he is fine? Yes, I think that he has ways of making up for his glaring lack of rim protection, lack of vertical athleticism with his elite hands, his elite defensive IQ, his elite defensive rebounding value. But ultimately, I think he is just a passable defender when he wants to be. Nothing more. I don't view him as some plus or some strong plus on that side of the ball like some people have made him out to be. But when you are the literal offensive GOAT, then I can still justify having you in my sixth spot. I slightly modified Jokic's peak from when we did our just like 10 greatest peaks in NBA history, period. At that point, I had it from 2021 to 2025, because 2021 is when he became the best player in the world to me. But I think 2023 to 2025 is more accurately his absolute peak. If you look at the totality of the last 5 years, though, it's ridiculous. I mean, 26, 12, and 9 on plus 9% relative true shooting. Never in NBA history will you see a combination of that sort of ridiculous offensive production as both a scorer and rebounder and playmaker with that sort of ridiculous astronomical efficiency. And then I still consider Jokic a playoff riser. I think that this was the roughest playoff run that he's had, going up against his best individual defender in Zoo, and then the best team defense we've seen in a couple decades in the Oklahoma City Thunder. But still, if you look at his playoff numbers over the last 3 years, I mean, 29, 13, and 9 on plus 4% relative true shooting. That's where in the playoffs, he has always been aggressive about dialing up his scoring volume. And that's a big part of the reason why I've always been so high on Jokic as a scorer. Over the last 5 years, he quite clearly has the best overall playoff scoring resume when you're talking about this combination of incredible volume and excellent efficiency. And he's just been the hardest guy to stop in the playoff context as a scorer over the last half decade. And in 2023, had, in my opinion, the greatest offensive playoff run we have ever seen and led one of the greatest playoff offenses ever while he's averaging 30, 13, and 10 on 63% true shooting. Like, he's just truly unstoppable offensively. The best that you can do is throw every single chip that you have at him as an elite defense and hope to take a little bit of a chunk out of his efficiency, maybe a little bit of a chunk out of his volume. But I do think a Jokic post-up is the greatest offensive play in NBA history. I just think his overwhelming strength as maybe the strongest player in basketball with the greatest touch that we've ever seen, where he can work his way to an 8-10 foot hook shot, and that is a 60 to 65% shot like him. I don't think anybody else has in NBA history been able to generate that sort of self-created offense in a one-on-one matchup without being dependent on getting all the way to the rim, which there are more defensive counters for, right? You can load up. And obviously you can throw doubles at Jokic, but now you are challenging the best passer in the league, easily the best passer out of the post we've ever seen, and a top 3 passer in NBA history to pick you apart, spotting cutters, finding shooters. He can make every pass in the book there, and he can see everything. And then, of course, he also has the ridiculous counters, the elite footwork, the turnaround that he can get to with such elite efficiency, get you with an up and under. So that post play is unmatched. I consider Jokic the best post player ever, not the best post scorer ever, let me be clear, but the combination of scoring and passing is unmatched. Shaq makes a really strong argument there. Absolutely.
Best post scorer.
Best post scorer? I think it's probably just Shaq on account of sheer unstoppability. It's Shaq or Kareem. Those would be my top two. And shout out to Hakeem. He'd be in my 3 spot. And then I think you start being able to argue Jokic. But it's the passing difference. Again, Shaq makes a case just with like his sheer ability to collapse defenses and what that frees up for his teammates. But then where Jokic separates from Shaq as an offensive player to me is the versatility. The fact that this is also a guy who shoots 50% from mid-range and has shot 40% from 3, better than that this past season. And in the playoffs has actually consistently hovered around that 40% number over the years, who can do it off movement, where he is elite curling around screens. He's also just got great feel as an off-ball player. As a cutter, he does things off-ball that we've never seen from somebody with his size. I'm talking about a 300-pound man who they're running Iverson cuts for, stuff like that. It's just absurd. And then he also brings this value as an elite screener. He's such an elite roll man when it comes to having that like ridiculous floater range touch where he's so absurdly efficient. And then also being able to pick you apart as a passer off the short roll, or being able to pop and shoot the jumper at a really high level. He's also phenomenal running inverted pick and roll, which is a total unicorn skill set of his. He's a dominant offensive rebounder. He is such a phenomenal playmaking hub when it comes to handoffs. He can push pace and transition. Like, offensively, as a big, he is completely without parallel. And when I compare him even to the other greats of the greats, the best offensive players ever, I most prefer his overall skill set, where you have this elite physical imposition, hyper efficient paint offense he can get to whenever, with the perimeter skill that he does have, with the on and off ball value, with the scoring playmaking balance he has. Like, I think he just checks the most boxes in totality. And there was a time, and it was not long ago, where I considered Jokic the best scorer, passer, and rebounder in the league simultaneously. And I still consider him to be top 2 in the league at all of those things. So that's where there are certain players who just defy any sort of like precedent or criteria you could try to lay out in terms of two-way players. That's why I hate the idea of like, oh, who's the best two-way player in the league? Because I don't really know what that means. Like, who is providing the most overall two-way value in the NBA today right now? It's Nikola Jokic. Like, I don't know, what is this threshold you have to hit in terms of he's this good on both sides of the ball? That doesn't matter to me. It's about overall impact. And Nikola Jokic is going to transform your offense in a way that we've arguably never seen in NBA history. I mean, there were stretches of this year where they had like a 130 offensive rating with Jokic and a sub 100 offensive rating without him. The fact that any like capable play finisher, if it's a cutter, if it's a spot-up shooter, is going to thrive alongside Jokic. The extent to which he frees up and improves the quality of life for a shot maker like Jamal Murray, right? His gravity as a roller and a popper and his ability to free him up as a screener, like what he does for a guy like that in the two-man game. He doesn't need another advantage creator to play alongside him. He doesn't need that much ball handling alongside him. He just doesn't need much. And so that allows you to prioritize defensive personnel if you're building optimally around Jokic, because you can sacrifice a little bit of offense because he's going to raise your level so much on that side of the ball. And defensively, we've seen him be capable in the playoffs every time. And we've seen him be, I would argue, in the 2023 playoff run, he was a slight positive defensively on a really good team defense that won the title, because he was able to fit in, be solid on that side of the ball while he's making them the best offense in basketball.
I mean, we're splitting hairs here, obviously, because we are talking about the greatest centers of all time, right? So these margins are going to be super close anyway. But this argument that you're making about Jokic and, you know, things that you can concede and how you build your roster construction, couldn't I make that same argument for Tim Duncan and his overall impact? But, you know, it's majority coming from defensively. Like, couldn't I make that same argument that you can lean a little bit more offensively on the other side of the ball because of, you know, the floor he gives you defensively? Like, to me, that's a difference. And I agree with you. I think it's really hard to make like arbitrary catch-alls with any of these guys because every player is so different and so unique. Like with me, with Duncan, I guess it did kind of come down to like a gut distinction. Like, I just wouldn't feel right having a player that is defensively limited as Jokic above him. But like, all the things that we're applying to Jokic offensively. I kind of feel that way about Tim Duncan defensively. And then I think he can kind of get underrated.
Well, I think there's a difference. I mean, as great as Duncan is defensively, do you think that defensively he's the equivalent of Jokic offensively? It's not like there's a big gap, but
No, I think it's probably Hakeem, but like Duncan's one of the greatest defensive big men of all time.
Absolutely.
Giving you this super high defensive floor. And then offensively, I think Duncan can kind of get underrated because of the era that he played in. Like, he's giving you 22 points per game and like 3 assists per game, but this is in an era where NBA teams are scoring 95 points per game, so it's a little bit different. So, like, I understand your argument, and wholeheartedly, Carson, I have nothing negative to say about Nikola Jokic. I'm not even going to try to make an anti-Jokic case because I don't think it exists. I just think that like Duncan's on-off numbers are so crazy in this time period. Like, he's, on average, like, in 2 separate seasons, in the my peak for Duncan is 03 to 05, but 2 separate seasons, the 05 season and the 07 season, he's improving.
In there?
I mean, I pick 3 year. My criteria is 3-year consecutive peaks, so I would go 03 to 05. But like the 05 season and the 07 season, he's improving the Spurs on off by 17 points. And so
that'd be a down year for Jokic. I'm just kidding, by the way. But what I am saying is, yes, I don't disagree at all with what you said, which is the exact same argument you can make about prioritizing personnel around Jokic, understanding his all-time great strength where he can make up for your roster. That works for Duncan too, which is why we literally are splitting hairs. Like,
well, the reason
there's not an objective argument to make for either one of these guys. What I would say is the reason that I framed it that way is you were framing it as, with Jokic's defense, I can't have him above Duncan. And what I would say is there's an argument for either one. They're both 2 of the greatest floor raisers we've seen. I think what Duncan did in 01 to 03 is absolutely ridiculous with those teams around him. He did it more on the back of all-time great defense and being a good enough offensive floor raiser. I would argue what Jokic has also done in recent years is absolutely ridiculous. And in terms of the literal on-off stuff, without parallel, and offensively, without parallel.
That's fair. I would say I prefer Duncan's. I don't know. Duncan's defensive skill set in the era that he played in, I think, is more valuable in the era that he played in than he would be like now, right, with some of his limitations. Again,
but that's all that matters. We're judging everybody within their era, man. It gets too weird if you try to do it any other way.
It does. And I mean, he was just dominant. Duncan was just so fucking dominant. 2 MVPs, 2 finals MVPs, 2 championships, 2 number 1 defenses in this time period. In the finals, he's given you 22, 16, and 4 with nearly 4 blocks a game. I just think Duncan's peak is a little bit higher. I mean, I have Duncan in my number 5 spot. That's why I'm arguing so adamantly about this, because I do have him a few spots higher, but this range, to me, I think is the most difficult of the list. I think, to me, the top 4 are pretty concrete. This is the era where I really think it gets contentious. I would just have a feeling in my stomach if I had Jokic above Duncan. I couldn't do it.
They're 2 of my favorite players of all time is the good news. So for me, I can't lose. And what I do want to say is it's kind of funny because I have Duncan number 7 on my centers peak list, and I have Duncan number 6 on my all-time greatest players list, which is where I think it is important to understand, like, Duncan's prime is so incredible because he comes into the league and he's a top 5 player immediately. And then he ascends and for a couple years is the best player in the world. And then he's delivering top 5 value for more than a decade of his career, right? The first decade of his career. And then he delivers top 10 value for a couple more years. And then for another handful of years, he delivers top 20 value. And then even when Tim Duncan is 39 years old, he is still a really good defensive anchor and is delivering top 40 value. Like, that's what's so incredible about him. Outside of LeBron, who is in a different tier from everybody else, like, Duncan's ability to bring legitimate high impact in one way or another every single season of his career for basically 2 decades is arguably unmatched. KD is getting there. Kareem, obviously, right, also incredible, but like Kareem's last year, he wasn't as impactful as Duncan's last year, and we're nitpicking here, but I think that's something that is so incredible about Duncan. I also think his peak is really high, though. And I'm going 02 and 03. I'm more inclined to like go on the earlier side around 03 than you are, it seems. That's when I think he does his most impressive floor raising of some rosters that I do think get overrated, as Robinson significantly falls off at this point. You're talking about even in the 03 run, Tony Parker and Manu Ginobili being babies, man, absolute babies. Like, Parker really struggled in that playoff run. Manu was a rookie in that playoff run, and Duncan was able to will them to a title in one of the most impressive individual postseason runs we've ever seen. I think about the 01 season when Derek Anderson was the number 2 scorer, and every year the Spurs are winning 58 to 60 games because they're a top 3 defense and they're a top 10 offense, like, very consistently. And like you said, Duncan's on off stuff in this range. It's really impressive. He's improving them by like 12 points per 100 possessions. That's a phenomenal number. He's giving you, in terms of box score production, 24.5, 13 and 4 over the 02 and 03 seasons, almost 3 blocks a game on plus 5% relative true shooting. And then in the playoffs, 25.5, 15 and 5 with 3.6 blocks per game on plus 5% relative true shooting. That's where the 03 playoff run is just so ridiculous. What he was doing defensively, what he was doing as the leading scoring option, what he was doing as an underrated passer at that point, who was far and away the defensive focal point. And I'm not going to say that Duncan was ever some great anticipatory passer, but his ability to take advantage of all that defensive attention and consistently, selflessly create for teammates was really, really valuable. That's why I think he was an underratedly good offensive hub, and I do consider him a top 3 defender of all time. Part of that is to do with like his longevity defensively in terms of absolute peak. I don't know if he's top 3, but whatever. I mean, he's clearly top 10. I just still do ever so slightly prefer the unparalleled offensive value that I'm getting from Jokic. But I think it's very easy to build a great team around either one of these guys. I think they are both underrated by some in their ability to just pick up so much slack for rosters in their own unique ways. I'm super high on Tim Duncan. I'm just going to say it one more time. The center position is just stupidly loaded in NBA history.
So you have Duncan in your 7 spot. You have Jokic in your 6 spot.
That's correct.
I have Jokic in my 7 spot, and I have Tim Duncan in my 5 spot.
So who's in your 6 spot, Logan? We got a gap to fill.
Yeah, so I know our criteria is different, and I want to preface this by saying I think this guy has a number 1 case. We did... Ooh, I'm calibrating.
Can you meet me up here?
Months ago, maybe a year. We did our... I don't know if it was that long ago. Within 2 years ago, we've done our top 10 peaks of all time.
Yes.
And so I have modified my list slightly since then. Jokic is on this list. He didn't make my top 10 peaks list. I don't know if he would have made it. He was like my number 11 guy I was considering. And to be clear, in this series, Carson and I have done guards, forwards, and centers. In that one, we did just top 10 peaks of any player of all time.
Yeah. Could I just say real quick, 7 centers were on that list of my top 10 peaks in NBA history. So Duncan is still on there. Jokic is on there. It's insane.
This guy was on my list too, and I had him pretty low. I said this exact same spiel in that video, and I'll reiterate it. I think this guy, if you wanted to argue it, has a legitimate number 1 case, not only in the center spot, in NBA history. I have Bill Russell here. I have nothing disparaging to say about Bill Russell because in his era, he was the most dominant player of his era. Like, the most valuable thing in that era was defense, protecting the rim, rebounding. Bill did all that at a high level. You look at some of the on-off numbers. I went with 61 to 63. He wins 3 MVPs. He leads out 3 number 1 defenses. He's given you 24 boards a night in the regular season with 4 assists per game and 18 points. In the playoffs, he's given you 21, 27, and 5. In the regular season, the Celtics won 75% of their games with Bill. Without Bill, he misses 7 games. They went 1-6. They won 14% of their games. Bill Russell has a number 1 case arguable on this list. He has a number 1 case arguable on the top 10 peaks period of any players in NBA history. I'm going to make a similar case to what I said about Jokic. When you are limited on one side of the basketball, I ultimately can't have you higher. I understand that that's maybe not the best way to think about these things, and we have to judge guys relative to era. I just wouldn't feel right when some of these guys aren't as limited offensively, and so that is where I think that I have Bill and Jokic together because I think they are uniquely limited on one side of the basketball. I understand that's not everybody's criteria. I understand that's not your criteria. And I acknowledge that if you have a different criteria, he could be number one. But I do have Bill here in my sixth spot. But I have such immense respect for Bill. Rest in peace. I wouldn't push back if somebody wanted to argue him as top three, as top five, as number one. Mm-hmm. Bill has that kind of case, and I don't want to act like he doesn't.
Yeah, I mean, my list comes down to impact. And so I do have Russell higher than you. I have him in my number 5 spot. I think that he is, to me, very clearly a top 4 player in NBA history. Again, we get into the difference between peak and prime. Bill Russell has a top of the line prime in the sense that he was in the NBA for 13 years, and every single one of those years was delivering absolute elite all-time kind of winning impact. That's a rarity. There are other guys on this list who are higher, who had higher absolute peaks, but were less consistent around those absolute peaks. And so Russell delivered more overall impact, overall value in totality in his career. But we are only talking about the absolute apex of the apex, and that's where I think there are a couple guys who just reached such ridiculously high levels on both sides of the ball that they're just absolute monsters at the center position. But so is Bill Russell. And I continually reiterate that this list is about impact because I hesitate to even bring up any sort of offensive limitation as a knock on Bill Russell. I guess it only would come up when you are going up against my top 4 peaks at the center position because they're all that ridiculous. And the reason that I say that is because within the context of his era, an individual great defensive big could be so much more impactful on that side of the ball than any player since could be impactful on either side of the ball. When you are talking about the GOAT on one side of the ball, it is Bill Russell defensively, and there is truly no conversation. There is no offensive player. There is no other defensive player. I have given this spiel many times, so forgive me if you've heard it before, but this dude engineered the greatest dynasty in NBA history. They won 11 titles in 13 years, and they won 11 titles because they were the best defense in basketball 12 times in those 13 seasons, overwhelmingly by a wide margin. On average, they outpaced the number 2 defense in basketball in defensive rating by 4 points. The gap between them and the next best was massive year after year after year, so much so that 3 times the Boston Celtics finished dead last in offensive rating and still won the title. They were that much better than everybody else defensively, and they were that defense singularly because of Bill Russell. Before he joined the team, they were a bad defense. He comes in as a rookie. They are immediately, comfortably the number 1 defense in basketball. He retires after 1969 when he wasn't at his peak value anymore, but still, he had them as the number 1 defense in basketball. After he leaves, they fall off to a below average defense. So you just have to understand, nobody has ever transformed one side of the ball like he did. And he did that by being an absolutely ridiculous pure rim protector. I think Bill Russell gets sold short for a number of reasons. Era bias is absolutely part of it. I also just think people not understanding how you could provide value in that time and people overvaluing offense in the box score.
I was just going to say, Bill Russell's legitimately really good passer, too. It's not like Bill was an offensive zero or anything like that. No. Bill, and those Celtics offenses, I think in a lot of ways were ahead of their time with some of the actions and stuff they were doing.
Well, they were able to run through him as a passing hub for sure when it comes to handoffs. They were absolutely adamant about pushing pace, and he was kind of the foundation of that as a guy who could grab, 25 rebounds a game for you and then was an outlet passer, but also could actually handle and run in a way that was so unique for a big at that time and pass. But what I was building to is I think people might have an easier time understanding just how insane Bill Russell was defensively if they had just tracked blocks back then. Because this dude was literally averaging 8 to 10 blocks per game. I've hand-tracked some games. He's consistently in that range. That's what people say from that time as well. And it's not just the greatest rim protection that we've ever seen at a time in which like the value of that rim protection could really surpass everything else on the basketball court. It's also his insane agility, his quickness, the fact that like this was a guy who could cover range defensively, just incredible. And the shot blocking numbers sell short the deterrence, the intimidation, the fact that nobody has ever made offensive players second guess a shot attempt more than Bill Russell. And of course, the signature testament to just his great IQ and selflessness that he was like the master of blocking shots inbounds to then start the fast break. It's all true. And he was an elite post defender. And he was so disciplined, so smart defensively. That's like the bread and butter of his case. And then offensively, I do think that Bill Russell is underrated, especially when you're talking about his peak, which I'll go 1962 and 1963. I think he improved as a passer at this time, and I think he became more assertive as a scorer. Where you look at the 62-63 playoffs, he averaged 21, 26, and 5 on plus 3% relative true shooting. Regular season, the volume was worse, the efficiency was worse, but I don't know, man. I'm a hell of a lot closer to moving Bill Russell up on this list than I am moving him down, because I am that adamant about the fact that there's no argument who was the greatest player of the 1960s, of this era in totality. It's Bill Russell, and honestly, I just think that the gap between him and Wilt grows in my eyes by the day. That being said, again, we're not talking about prime. We're not talking about total impact here. We're talking about absolute peak, and it just so happens that Wilt, for 3 years, or especially 2 years, especially 1 year, locked the fuck in, and as probably the most talented basketball player we've ever seen relative to era, made the most out of all that talent in a way that he didn't do for the rest of his career. But that's where, again, the absolute peak point is the only reason that I don't have Bill Russell higher than this.
Agreed. I mean, career, he's a lock.
Yeah. God, what a monster. I will defend Bill Russell until the day I die. Bill Russell, Bill Walton. Boy, we've got some of my GOATs on this list. Makes sense. Some of the best players ever. So you have Duncan at 5. I have Russell at 5. Let's get in to the top 4, Logan. Who's in your 4 spot?
So I have since called an audible on the top bigs on my list since we did that episode. I have Hakeem here at 4, and I've just rearranged these centers in a different order. Honestly, when we get here, I think it's so close between everybody.
I'd include Russell in that. I think
me too.
Is that close for me.
You could make an argument for any of these guys as your number 1. Even like Hakeem, dude. I have so much respect for Hakeem. Hakeem is one of my favorite guys to go back and just watch clips of. It is beautiful. I think it is portable to any era. Like, it's just translatable offensively and defensively. Specifically the years I went with Hakeem, 93 to 95. In the regular season, he's given you 27, 12, and 4 with 1.8 steals per game and 3.8 blocks per game. In the playoffs, he's given you 30, 11, and 4 with 1.5 steals per game and 3.7 blocks per game. In the 94 finals, he holds Patrick Ewing to 36% from the field and 39% true shooting. The 95 finals and the playoffs, they go on one of the greatest runs of all time, and they sweep the young Orlando Magic. He leads every finals game in scoring. I think the guy's the second best defender ever. He is the best player in the league over this time period. Crazy two-way impact, and could just dominate any era. And that's what, the defense is so translatable, and then the offense, I just think, fits with any era. The best footwork ever. The guy's got automatic elite touch from 15 feet and in, if it's fadeaways, if it's turnaround J's, if it's hooks, and he's doing it on the league's best defenders. This version of Hakeem is so dominant, man. And I had Hakeem higher when we did our original list. Since then, I think I've just come to appreciate one of the league's most dominant forces of all time just a little bit more. So, Yeah, I don't have anything negative to say about any of these guys that we're going to talk about today.
Yeah.
The only reason that Hakeem's not higher is just because there's a few guys that were a little bit more dominant offensively, that were still very effective defensively. But again, the margins are so close here that I would hear an argument for Hakeem probably all the way up to number 2.
That's where I have Hakeem, at number 2. And it is extremely, extremely close, but this is another instance where I think we make the distinction between absolute peak and prime or total career or whatever, because I actually think Hakeem has one of the most distinct 3-year apexes in NBA history. And that's not to say that he wasn't a great player basically from the moment he set foot in the league. He was, but 1993, he takes 2 simultaneous leaps. He gets better as a scorer. I mean, his volume goes way up from under 22 points per game to 27. His efficiency jumps by multiple points. And this is when he fully realizes his mastery as a post scorer. But he also gets better as a passer. That was really the limitation of Hakeem before 1993. He just was not a willing passer. He was not a good passer. And so that limited his offensive impact because he was this big who was like a volume sort of post-up isolation hub, right? Needed a lot of touches there. Wasn't the most efficient because he relied a lot on his tough shot making. And then also wasn't a good passer. And so Houston just had a lot of pretty mediocre offenses through the first stretch of Hakeem's career. But at this point, he starts leading out some really good offenses. Like immediately they jump from the number 20 offense in 92 to the number 6 offense in 93. I want to give some credit to improved spacing around him in these years for that. But I do think a lot of it is Hakeem's own improvement offensively, where in 1993 to 1995, he's one of the greatest playoff scorers we've ever seen and goes on 2 of the most dominant and impressive individual runs we've ever seen. I mentioned 03 Duncan, 23 Jokic. Those would be in my top 10. Hakeem's got 2 spots in my top 10, and he did them back to back because he is clearly the best scorer in the NBA with Michael Jordan out of the league, and he's also a top 2 defender of all time. Is he delivering top 2 defensive value ever in 1995? Maybe it's just short of that, but I still think overall, if you look at this 3-year stretch, I'd take him as the best defender on the planet, even over a David Robinson, even over a Patrick Ewing. And this is a stacked era for defensive talent because he just has, this crazy combination of such unique fluidity, agility, elite strength, and being the best rim protector of the modern era, and also having such phenomenal hands. Like the things that Hakeem was doing defensively are just absolutely unfathomable. And then he does go in the 94 and 95 playoffs and gives you 31, 11, 4.5 assists with 5 stocks per game on plus 3% relative true shooting. The playoffs is really where Hakeem makes his case to me. And I'll compare him to the guy who I have in my 4 spot, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who I think if we could combine all of Kareem's best traits, like if we could blend early 70s Kareem's defense with late 70s Kareem's offense, well, yeah, Kareem might be number 1 on this list. I would have him above Hakeem. But that's just not the reality. Kareem in the early 70s still had enough flaws offensively where he hadn't fully mastered the skyhook. His touch wasn't as great as it would be. His strength wasn't as good as it would need to be for his offense to hold up better in the later years. I think he got better as a passer in the later 70s. He just held up better in the playoffs, was more efficient in every way. But then you have the fact that by the late 70s, he was no longer like the top level defender he was in the early 70s. I just think Hakeem has a better combination of being so utterly dominant on both sides of the ball at the same time. And it's really the playoffs where he got even better. Whereas Kareem, if you're looking at 71, 72, they win the title in 71, but his efficiency dipped by 10 points in terms of true shooting compared to the regular season. That's where his offense just didn't translate quite as seamlessly, when I do still think he was at his overall best because the defense was that great. But when Hakeem could, in any matchup, at any point in the postseason, get to the same shot diet that made him so great in the regular season, and make those shots with the same efficiency, if not better, at even better volume, that's such a great thing. That's such an incredible asset to have in the playoffs where even though he didn't have that ability to get to hyper-efficient offense like a Kareem did in the regular season. Nevertheless, you look at these years that I'm comparing, and Hakeem was more productive in terms of volume and more efficient in the playoffs and just more impressive overall. So that's why I would give him the slight edge.
So I have Kareem in my 3 spot above Hakeem. I did take those years from 77 to 79.
Okay.
And it's really marginal. I still think I completely agree with what you said. Like, Kareem isn't at his absolute apex in both ways. Like, so much more of a dominant athlete when he entered the league, right out of college at UCLA. But I do think he's still a different caliber of offensive player than Hakeem at this stage in his career. Like, and I still think he's a really damn good defender. And I don't really hold any of the lack of team success against Kareem because he's still churning out top 10 defenses and top 5 offenses. That being said, I also don't want to undersell the fact, even though I have Kareem above Hakeem, I don't want to undersell the fact that Hakeem is taking some not like dominant teams in winning the finals with them, because that is the most ridiculous aspect of Hakeem's case to me. That like these, like, again, I don't think Kareem's supporting casts are great by any means in this era that I'm talking about, but neither are Hakeem's. Like, the 94 team is kind of a ridiculous carry job, even though the 95 team adds Clyde Drexler and they add Mario Elie. Like, those are not great teams by any means.
And in 1995, he has to go through the toughest
60
path,
wins,
arguably, in history. Also, Mario was on both teams, but they add Clyde, but that's offset by, okay, now you're playing as the 6th seed and you have to go through all the best teams in basketball. Good luck. I think that's a good point to bring up. I do think that's where Hakeem's ability to elevate those supporting casts at this time was unbelievable. I gave them props for the spacing being ahead of its time, but, I mean, he was the defense, and there just wasn't that much creation. There wasn't much high-level offensive skill alongside him. And even once Clyde got there, we're talking about certainly post-peak Clyde. So that's part of what makes his 2-year stretch so ridiculously impressive.
Kareem is still monstrous at this stage in his career. From 77 to 79 in the regular season, he's giving you 25, 13, and 5 on 60% true shooting with nearly 1.5 steals per game and 3.4 blocks per game. And then in the playoffs in that same period is giving you 31, 15, and 4 on 63% true shooting with nearly 4 blocks per game. It's just tough because it's like, I feel like some people may go with early Kareem because he has the team success and he is so dominant as a defender, but I don't think he was as polished offensively, where I think Oscar deserves some credit, for being the primary ball handler. And Oscar's not at the peak of his powers either at that stage, but he's still a really good offensive player, and he's taking some of that load off of Kareem. And then later in Kareem's career, he wins even more with the Lakers, and Magic's the best offensive player on those teams. I just think this is the best blend of Kareem, of offense and defense. I think this is the peak of his offensive powers, but I think he's still giving you really high defensive value. He just doesn't have the team success that came earlier in his career and later in his career. Ultimately, I don't hold that against him, and I still think there's enough of an offensive gap where I do prefer Kareem to Hakeem, but it's very, very marginal.
It's really hard for me to even pick a version of Kareem to start with. So I did land on 71 to 72. Maybe I could stretch that peak out a little bit, but I don't know. It's really hard because 73, he has a really, really, really rough postseason. Once you get to 74, he's pretty incredible that year. So maybe I could make it that 4-year stretch, but I consider these his 2 best years, and yet, as I mentioned, in the playoffs, it didn't translate at the same level. I am going to slightly take this, though, just because I still think the fact that this was a guy who, in the regular season, could give you 33 points per game on plus 10% true shooting while he is anchoring a top 2 defense in basketball every year. And, truly, he was responsible for that. I mean, his rim protection was so monstrous. He was more mobile defensively at this time. That is just such a ridiculous value to have from one player. but then there are some playoff issues. Maybe you're higher on late 70s Kareem's defense than I am. That's where I do see like a big gap.
Do you think
I think the offensive gap where he improved is as big as the defensive regression, and they end up being basically as good as a player, and you could pick either one and I'd have no problem with it. But I do think the block numbers are very nice. I don't think they fully reflect, though, how his motor really was up and down. He wasn't the sharpest help defender. He wasn't the most engaged in transition. Like, he wasn't always moving his ass to get back on defense, like stuff like that, where it's not going to be really captured in the box score. But if you look at the impact stuff, I mean, again, young Kareem, didn't matter really how good the group around him was. He was going to make you top of the league defensively. He did not have that same singular impact in the Lakers years.
I get that. I just think those teams were so far away, man. I don't think he was winning a title, or, you know, I think that was kind of impossible with some of these supporting casts.
But it's not like the defense ever came back, really, is the thing. It's not like there was a resurgence on that side.
Yeah,
and it didn't keep them from winning titles because they were that great.
I mean, they're still top 10, though. I mean, it's not like they're bad defenses.
No, we're holding these dudes to a ridiculously high bar now, brother. We're talking about Hakeem versus Kareem at their absolute best. My feelings on which version of Kareem I could take could change by the end of this conversation, because when I do think about the offensive force he was, 77 to 79, how it translated to the playoffs, the mastery of everything that, again, he didn't have as nailed down in his early years, that's very compelling, because this version of Kareem makes a very strong case for being the greatest post scorer ever. I think is a top 3 offensive center ever. But yeah, I just think the defensive dip is enough to keep him in my 4 spot. But
okay,
golly, is it close.
What years do you have specifically?
71 and 72.
Got you.
But don't ask me again, because I'll change my mind. I actually stuck with that from when we did our top 10 peaks overall, but this is something that is so incredible about Kareem. I mean, there's just a decade where he's flat out the best player in the world every single year. And that starts when he sets foot in the NBA, in my opinion. It's not as inarguable maybe when he's a rookie, but I consider rookie Kareem the best player in the NBA.
Quick aside.
Yeah, pick a side. Shout out. Good guys.
Who do you think? Do you think we've been talking about this a lot in the offseason, just about like longevity. Who do you think has like the top 5 like longevity of all time? Is it Kareem, Duncan, LeBron, KD, or all those guys in there to you?
And I don't want to say it, Karl Malone. That would be my top 5. Not necessarily in order. I think those are the 5 dudes with the best longevity in NBA history. Yeah, but longevity, obviously, Kareem is incredible. To be on top of the world for a decade, only dudes who have ever done that are him, Michael Jordan, and LeBron, where you're the best guy. Where, again, I have Kareem as a clear top 3 player of all time. Well, maybe Bill Russell could make a case, but I have him as my number 3 player. And his peak is still crazy, but he sets himself apart more with how long he sustained it.
Getting back on track, so
sure.
Didn't you have, correct me if I'm wrong, didn't you have Shaq number 1 last time we did top 10 peaks? Or am I misremembering that?
Shaq is my number 1 peak of all time?
Yeah.
No. I had Shaq as my number 3. I had MJ and then LeBron and then Shaq.
Well, that's right, but Shaq was the number 1 big man to you, correct?
Yep.
Okay. So that still holds true. You've got Wilt in your 3 spot.
That holds true.
Interesting. I have Wilt in my number 1 spot.
Look, man, it's cheeky. I like it. Let me explain why I have Wilt at number 3. Because I think the 1967 season alone would be number 2 for me, and I can see the argument for number 1. The thing is, I think Wilt is the player with the most truly distinct brief prime in his career, where you look at the way he was playing in 67 and 68. You can include 66 if you want, but he really, really finds the perfect balance in 67 and 68. And, like, it is the most different from who he was the rest of his career, where the guy comes into the league and literally won't pass. And I think that Warriors Wilt is, like, pretty dramatically overrated, just because in terms of impact, like, yeah, okay, he comes in and he averages 37 a game as a rookie and wins MVP, and they're the second worst offense in basketball. And they really just weren't a very good team with him over those years. In fact, they traded him when they were 10-28 with him that season. So that's where I think that version of Wilt, who scored 50, who has all the biggest raw scoring numbers, like the impact just doesn't match that. But then when you get to his Sixers years, now we're talking about a guy who, as I said earlier, relative to his peers, is probably the most talented basketball player ever. When it comes down to being as massive as he was, biggest dude in the league, as fast as he was, as strong as he was, as bouncy as he was, having the skill that he did with the turnaround, the fadeaway, the finger roll, with his ability as a passer when he chose to tap into it, with his ability as a defender when he chose to tap into it. Like, I just don't think there's ever been anybody like Wilt Chamberlain within the context of their time. But again, he didn't tap into these things until he gets to the 76ers, and then he did. And that's why 1967 Wilt is on the very short list for greatest seasons of all time. The guy gave you 24, 24, and 8 on plus 14% relative true shooting, while he anchored an elite defense and the number one offense in basketball and a 68-win team, the best in basketball, that won the title. He just became this hyper-efficient scorer, turned down his volume, but got so ridiculously efficient and leveraged his scoring threat to the max as this excellent playmaking hub. If it's out of the post, if it's running handoffs through him. So it's just such an awesome balance of scoring and playmaking as a great offensive engine, while he was the second best defender on the planet at this time, only to Bill Russell, in my opinion. And in fact, in 1968, led out the only number one defense that did not belong to a Russell Celtics team in his entire career. 1967 Wilt maxed it all out, right? It's just one glorious season. The reason that I knock him just a little bit is because we are judging multi-year peaks here. And in 1968, even though he was still doing a lot of the same great stuff, he just didn't match the same efficiency. He's only plus 6% relative true shooting, which is still good, obviously, very good, but not stratospheric like it was. And then his free throw shooting was so bad at this time. Like, even as Wilt in so many ways is peaking, his free throw shooting is somehow hitting an all-time low, and that's a really, really low bar to begin with, where he shoots 38% from the line in back-to-back playoff runs, and that really knocked his playoff efficiency overall, where he's only plus 3% relative true shooting. So
from the regular season over that time period, he drops 5% in true shooting.
Like, it's crazy. It's crazy. And that's really the biggest problem with him. I think it's the massive issue that was the free throw shooting, and then just a little bit of the playoff dropping. And even though I think he is absolutely the best player on both sides of the ball, the engine for the 67 Philadelphia 76ers, I also don't want to undersell that he did have a really good team, and he was the fourth leading scorer for that team in the finals because he had alongside him Hal Greer, who's perennially underrated, and Chet Walker, and Billy Cunningham, and Wally Jones. It was a really, really good team. Wilt made them what they were, no question, and that's why I am this high on his peak, but I can't get there above Shaq when it comes to the difference in the postseason, where Shaq put together a 3-year run of playoff dominance that Hakeem comes close to, but realistically, probably only MJ and LeBron can really contend with. And Wilt just wasn't that same level of dominant force in the playoffs.
I understand that argument, but I just don't think anybody ever put it together completely in totality the way Wilt did. And so because we're not doing – this isn't a career ranking, because this is just Apex, that is why I think when we judge him relative to his era, Wilt is so – beyond everybody. Wilt is already like a mythical creature in terms of his frame and his size and his athleticism for his time. Like, he is the best athlete of his generation as well, and he's so far above everybody else. But when he did put it together, you're getting a guy that put together the best defense in the league while being the best offensive player in totality in basketball. One, I just think that is such a exceptionally rare combination when you can be the best offensive and defensive player in basketball. But I mean, the fact that he was effectively unstoppable, you had no answer for him because he finally decided to pass the ball. I mean, we're talking about what ifs, man. I mean, what if Wilt had decided to stop geeking and just locked in for his entire career? I mean,
for real,
Wilt maybe, I mean, you tell me if you disagree. Wilt maybe has like the most untapped potential, even though he's one of the greatest players ever.
No, I agree. I think it's the biggest gap between talent and value over the course of a career in NBA history.
Yeah, and that all that being said, even though this peak is brief, he did tap into that, and I just have to respect that. The fact that he is the best athlete head and shoulders in the league. He is the best offensive player in the league. He's the best defensive player in the league. I just think that's, I mean, for that, yeah.
Russell wasn't at his best defensively. I still think that he was the best.
So
defender,
Wilt, maybe
I would have Wilt
second best, right?
Sure.
So
and I just
think,
Thurmond.
Yeah, respect Nate Thurmond. Shout out Willis Reed, too. It's just such a rare combination that I don't think anybody else matches in NBA history. I understand the Shaq argument, though, and I would never try to downplay the most dominant. I don't think there's ever been anybody as physically imposing and as physically dominant as Shaq was at his apex.
It's just absolutely ridiculous, and Wilt and Shaq probably have got to be the two greatest physical outliers in NBA history, and if not that, then certainly the two that we've seen at the center position. The difference is Wilt didn't always play like he was the biggest, strongest dude on the court, right? He liked the finesse. Shaq, 2000 to 2002, we've just never seen an overwhelmingly dominant force like that. He was so completely unstoppable, and I consider him kind of in this two-man group of the greatest geometry of the court changers in basketball history. It's Steph Curry with what he can do from beyond the arc, extending defenses out to distances they'd never been extended to before, all the attention that he demands off ball from ridiculous distances. And then it is Shaq with his unrivaled ability to completely and utterly collapse defenses over and over and over again, where you have to understand, if you try to guard him one-on-one with any human being on the planet, he is either going to bury them under the basket or he is going to still move them and get to a hook shot that he can hit with really good efficiency. One-on-one Shaq is going to kill you. Or you're going to have to double team him. He might still score against the double team him, triple team him, front him, double him before he even catches the ball. Like, whatever the alternative is to letting him bully you one-on-one, you are going to have to dedicate such ridiculous amounts of defensive attention. You're going to basically create a wide open shot for his teammate every time, which is why I think even though I chose Jokic as the greatest post player ever because of that scoring passing combination, Shaq is right there, because even though he's not going to have obviously nearly the same assist numbers, the advantage creation is the greatest that we've ever seen, just with that sheer physical force. It's so absurd, and that's why he's one of the great offensive engines ever in this unique way. I mean, throughout his Orlando and LA years, he basically was an automatic top 3 offense for you. The Lakers were also like 12 points per 100 better with him on the floor across these years. And specifically, when you're looking at 2000, Shaq was an elite defensive player that season. I wouldn't characterize him as an elite defender over the totality of these 3 years. I just think that there were too many motor issues. I think even in his time, it wasn't nearly as significant as it would later become, but there was a lack of mobility with him that kept him from ever being in conversation for the best defender in the league or whatever. But he anchored such a dominant defense in 2000, number 1 defense in basketball. His rim protection was so monstrous. His deterrence was so monstrous. His rebounding value was so great. And that was the most consistent he ever was in terms of motor and conditioning and whatnot. I think regardless over these 3 years, you view him as a really good defender in totality, not maybe elite over the 3 years, but then you're talking about top 2 offensive big man peak in NBA history. And again, especially in the playoffs, over these 3 years, 30, 14.5, and 3 on plus 5% relative true shooting win the title every year. I think those raw numbers somehow even undersell his dominance and impact, because you got to think dead ball era, and you got to think all the ridiculous measures that defenses are trying to employ for anybody but Shaq to beat them. And then the finals, 36, 15, and 3.5 with 3 blocks a game on 60% from the field. That's over 3 years, man. It's just so stupid how high the two-way peak here was. I got to have Shaq number one.
That was the one thing I was going to say that Shaq really does have in his favor is he left no doubt, right? Like Wilt, we're talking about it. Like he left, there's some food left on the table, right? He's got some crumbs on his plate. Shaq does. That's not even, I didn't even mean to make that a food joke with Shaq.
Wow.
But Shaq did. Shaq left no doubt. 2000 finals, 38-17-2, 61% from the field. 01 finals, 33-16-5, 57% from the field. 02 finals, 36-12-4 on 60% from the field. Like, again, Shaq left no doubt, and that is the advantage. Also, another thing I want to hammer home here, I mentioned this earlier with Duncan. Shaq is doing this when the league average for points per game is 95 points per game. He's giving you 30. I just want to add that in because I think that adds some much-needed context to, like, it's a different kind of 30 points per game, you know, from, like, 96 to, you know, like 2010-ish. You know, that's that kind of range of basketball where I'm not trying to take away from anybody that averages in this era, but he is getting 30 in a different era of basketball.
I think that's good to point out. And also the other thing that I want to make sure is understood about Shaq is that he was a legitimately good passer, and so he was capable of taking advantage of those ridiculous amounts of defensive attention thrown at him. He did have legitimately good touch, and so it's not just being the greatest physical force ever. It's pairing it with that. I kind of just get higher and higher on Shaq. I mean, I think I've had him as a top 3 peak ever for a while, but just thinking about like the totality of what he did, how great he was from the jump, like the dominant 12 seasons he really gives you before you start seeing some significant decline. And there's nothing like 2000 to 02 Shaq. That's a different beast, especially 2000 Shaq. Good Lord. But what a great player. And I think a few years ago, like, I probably didn't fully appreciate just how monumental his offensive value is because there's nobody who's ever been an offensive engine like him. And you kind of think like, oh, is he relying on perimeter play more so? And the answer is like, not really, man. As long as you put competent perimeter players around him, you're going to be an elite offense when you have peak Shaq on your team.
What changed for you?
I just think understanding truly the extent to which he is reshaping defenses in a way that nobody else has in NBA history. I think that's where, like, overall a few years ago, honestly, I probably put too much value in kind of the idea of, like, the perimeter player being the guy who late in games is more responsible for creating and whatnot, when really I think in totality, I mean, what Shaq did as an offensive engine is ridiculous. Actually, like, his clutch numbers are awesome in the playoffs. His clutch performance is awesome. It's just stupid, man. I mean, there's not a hole to poke in the game of Shaq over these 3 years, and that's why people do talk about him as the most dominant force ever. And when you are talking about absolute apex, people do talk about him with LeBron and MJ. The guy was just that ridiculously great. I gotta say, Logan, having done this 5-hour podcast the other day, I'm kind of jonesing to do a top 10 players of all time period episode with you. I know that we did it a couple years ago, but my list has changed a little bit.
As it does, man. Your opinions should be fluid, and you should
Maybe
always...
we save it another year. Maybe we give Wardell Stephen Curry another year to boost his longevity so we can argue him even higher. Jokic, could he start flirting with a top 10 a year from now? Probably not, but a few years. I don't know, man. I just have so much fun talking about basketball legends, doing these all-time rankings, and that's the big one. Something to consider. I guess you and I can talk about this in private, Logan. We shouldn't do this in front of the people, because what if we get into an argument, how terrible it is when we get into arguments, and it's just better to keep that between us and keep that in the bedroom. Wouldn't you say?
I try to keep my arguments out of the bedroom personally.
Boy,
my bedroom is a sanctuary.
That's nice. That's very, very classy. And that's why we say never go to bed angry.
Well, actually, my bad.
I live by.
My bad. Our bedroom is a sanctuary.
You.
Yeah.
Well, obviously, I was feeling offended by that, but I'm glad that you made the correction. Is there anybody who we didn't mention today, man, who really deserves a shout?
I mean, there's so many good centers in NBA history. I mean, the toughest.
Like Daniel Gafford we didn't bring up.
Desagna Diop.
Yeah.
Dude, I really wanted to have Dwight on my list. Dwight was like the most heartbreaking cut for me. I mean, I have nostalgia, obviously, for that era of basketball. It's when I was a kid first watching basketball. Like, one of my first basketball memories ever is Dwight in the dunk contest with the Superman cape. And that's when I really, Dwight was one of the first guys that I remember watching and just being in awe of his abilities and just what a freak athlete he was in that build. So it hurt me to, he was, and I don't have that much of a soft spot for Embiid as well, just objectionally, so I did have a tough time leaving Dwight off my list. Who was Embiid the toughest guy for you?
Moses or Embiid, they were both tough. I do think that Ewing was tougher for me than Dwight, though. I have become something of a Ewing defender. I think that compared to Dwight, he was just a better offensive player, just clearly a better scorer. And I think defensively, honestly, really comparable. Here's a good stat. And this is over his entire career. This is not just his peak seasons. 15 years with the Knicks. They won 58% of their games when Ewing played, just 42% without him. That's a big, big difference. And again, that's not just his absolute peak seasons. That's just the number that I already had available. So I do think his impact is incredible. I think regular season Patrick Ewing was a monster, just didn't translate to the playoffs. But there's so many great old centers. We went this entire episode without bringing up MVPs. I know you mentioned Cowens. We didn't bring up Wes Unseld. I think Nate Thurmond, who I did briefly mention, defensively is one of the best we've ever seen. There's so many greats.
Bro, we're to Bob Lanier, bro.
Wow. Okay.
You ain't want to put no respect on number 1 overall pick Bob Lanier, bro.
I would go Bob McAdoo before I go Bob Lanier. Bob Lanier was very
Bob McAdoo's a good shout.
Bob McAdoo was an absolute monster, man. And in fact, he was putting up just raw scoring numbers at the center position that we really didn't see until Joel Embiid. You look at what he did from 74 to 76. The guy was putting up 32 a game. He had his issues, and that's why Bob McAdoo didn't come up today, but the position is just absolutely stacked. There's nothing like it in the scope of NBA history. This was a joy. I had so much fun, and I hope you guys did too. If you did, the good news is there's so much more Nerd Sesh content. We've already ranked the top 10 peaks at all these different position groups, guards, forwards, and centers in NBA history. We've ranked the top 10 players at every position in the NBA today. We're doing NFL season preview content. We are doing trivia collabs with the best and brightest in the biz over and over and over again. That's on our YouTube channel. You can listen to all those shows across all audio platforms. And, Logan, we are going viral every single day on social media. TikTok, at NerdSesh, Instagram, at NerdSesh, Twitter, at Nerd_Sesh. What do we got there? We got trivia videos. Sometimes I play a silly game called Hoop Grid. Sometimes I do an original take. Logan's answering questions. Logan and I are bonding. We're finding ourselves in this beautiful world, and we want you all to be a part of it. And we also want you all to be a part of our Discord. If you want to, you can join that at the link that is in our link tree across our social media bios and chat with the gang there. Oh, Logan, I'm just feeling filled with a joy and a love for life and a joie de vivre.
A what?
A joie de vivre, as the French say.
The hell does that mean?
It just means a general joy for life, man.
Fuck yeah.
A vivaciousness.
Yes.
A jubilant feeling is consuming me. Hell yeah.
That's what it's all about, man.
That is what it's all about, man. I guess that's what talking about the top 10 center peaks ever will do to AMF. Golly. And with that, as always, appreciate you guys. I've been Carson Brabber.
I have been Logan Camden.
And this was Nerd Sesh.